Hello everybody, it's Murray here and welcome to another in our series of how to paint water acrylic painting tutorials, where we're going to use really neutral realistic colours to paint this realistic wave painting really easily, and how to paint shallow water and sea foam. So let's get into it. So these are the colours that I use today. They are titanium white, cad yellow, light grey, phthalo green, phthalo blue, ultramarine blue, dioxazine purple and burnt umber brown. Now I've prepped a 12 by 16 inch sort of medium sized canvas, and all I've done is I created a pencil outline. And then what I tend to do is I use cerulean blue or like a bright blue just to create an outline, because I find it so much easier to have an outline on my painting before I start trying to guess where everything's going to be. We're going to have a big wave coming onto the beach. We're going to have a little wave here and then a big large sort of powerful wave crashing towards the beach, and some backup ripples just off into the distance, so I can teach you perspective. So if you'd like to copy down the outline, feel free. Please dry your outline so you don't have the blue mix in. And we're going to start by painting the sand. Now to paint the sand, we're going to mix lots of white, a little bit of yellow, and we're going to use purple to nullify the yellow and make it look more grey. So purple kind of makes it look more brownish, gives it like a greyish brownish tinge. So we are going to add purple to our mix, and that should make it look more earthy, more neutral and more realistic. So a lot of colour mixing is just trying to get your colours to look real. And I'm just going to use a big brush, and all I'm going to do, I'm going to paint the bottom right corner in this lovely sort of kind of buttery yellow sort of colour. Because it's got a hint of purple, it looks very realistic. Now my brush kept shredding for some reason, and lots of the bristles kept coming out, so excuse me if I have to stop and pick away at the bristles. If that happens to you, please put that in the comments below. It seems to always happen to me when I buy new brushes. And then all I'm going to do, I'm going to create the same mix, look, yellow and white, but I'm going to add a little bit more purple this time as I move towards my wave. So it's much more grayer and cooler because it's got that purple in the mix. Can you see it's slightly darker? When I put it on the canvas, look, you can see it's slightly cooler because it's got more purple in it. And I'm just going to gently blend it into the previous colour as I move down into the canvas. So all I'm going to do, look, I'm just going to cover this area and gently blend it. Just taking my time, but unfortunately I got the rage because my bristles were coming off everywhere. And I had to keep picking away at them, so excuse me while I'm doing that. But all I'm doing, look, I'm just gently blending around the outline. And what we're trying to do, if you think that the wave is coming onto the shore, but the water's transparent, so we're trying to match the sand colour underneath, and we're going to blend it into the ocean colour, and it should make our water look completely see-through, you see? So now all I'm going to do is I'm just going to mix a little bit more of that colour. So white, a little bit of yellow. So you're going to use quite a lot of white today because it's very like neutral and pastel. And then quite a lot of purple to turn it a little bit darker. So let's add more purple. We're just going to get slightly more purple than the previous colour. Just slightly, literally. We want everything to be very natural, so we don't want huge jumps in colour. So it's just a slightly, it looks almost the same, but it's just slightly darker. Acrylics always dry darker than you think, so sometimes when you're laying the colour it looks pretty much identical, but then once they've dried, after about 5 minutes it starts to get darker. So let's add more purple to our mix to get it even cooler, because we're turning it more in towards the water. So look how much purple that is. So we're going to add lots of purple, a little bit of yellow just to warm her up. And then we're going to use ultramarine blue. Now ultramarine blue is like a purpley cool blue. So by adding that, look, we should get this nice sort of purpley colour. And all we're going to do, look, we're just going to gradually cover up this area and just try to blend it into the previous colour. Now what I can do, look, I can make X shapes with my brush, and this brush is really good, but there's still a big jump in transition, and we kind of don't want that. We want the water to look super realistic. So by just spending 5 minutes trying to blend it, you kind of can make it look quite realistic. But here's a trick, is going back to your previous colour, so the lighter shade, and then blending it. Look, you can just go over the top and just blend the two shades together. So I do this with skies often, all the time, when I'm blending horizons and things. Painting water is exactly the same. If you keep the previous colour that you've mixed, and then look, you blend into it, it looks just really nice and soft. Just spending, obviously the footage is speed up for the tutorial, but if you just spend 5 minutes just blending your work, this underpainting is just important as all the highlights and the details that we're going to put on top, because having a nice blended water, it makes it look incredibly real. So take your time. Obviously this video is fast. If you need to slow the video down, please help yourself and slow it down. So all we're going to do, look, I'm going to add ultramarine blue to my mix, so it's becoming more cooler, because as the water goes out towards the ocean, there's going to be less sand that is mixing, and it's going to be more water, and the deeper you go in the water, the darker it gets. So the more shallow, the more see-through the water is, and the darker, the more deeper the water. So we're just going over the top with this nice grey blue, just mixing it into our previous colour. And then, as I say, you can always go back to the previous colour and just gently mix if you find there's a big jump in transition. But can you see now, all we're doing is blending, and that blending is the secret. That's what's making it look so real. And I'm just adding more blue to my mix. See that lovely sort of cool grey blue, because it's got the yellow, the white and the purple in it. And then as we go out into the deeper water, into the ocean, it's getting more blue. It looks more deep. I'm going to leave my bright blue wave just there. We'll block her in later, so don't worry about that. So all I want to do, I want to darken my corners. So that brush went in the trash because it was awful, and I'm covered in paint from picking out the bristles. But we have this lovely underpainting now. So we've gone from really warm colours to medium colours to darker colours to cooler blues and purples. So we've gone from one bright colour to the other. So now we're going to paint the waves over the top, and I've got a flat headed brush because I find it much easier to kind of paint straight lines with it. We're going to mix our yellow and purple. So we're going to mix yellow and purple to create sort of a brown colour. We're going to add white to it to make it nice and pastel. So you can see that. Add a little bit more purple to turn it more grey, and some ultramarine blue to turn it even greyer and cooler. And we should have a cool sort of grey. And what we're going to do, we're going to paint the far away waves. Now we don't want them too dark because we want them to look far off into the distance. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to wipe off most of the paint on my t-shirt, but you can use a nice clean cloth if you don't want to just get your clothes dirty. And all I'm going to do is my outline that I can still see, I'm just going to go over it with this nice cool grey. Look, I can darken it up by adding it more blue. If I find it's too dark, and a little bit more purple. If I find it's too dark, I can add more white to it to turn it more grey. So just remember, you don't want it too dark. So we've got warm colours and we've got cool colours. So if we want to make it cooler and make more of a grey colour, we can add blues and purples. If we want to make it warmer, we can add things like yellows. But I don't want to make it too dark, because if I make it too dark, it will bring it closer to the viewer. So by having this ultramarine blue and lots of white, it pushes it back to make it look like, look, it's in the distance. And as I say, acrylics always dry darker, so if you find it dries too dark, you can always go over the top with some white and lighten it up. So look, all I'm doing, I'm just making some little ripples with the flat head of my brush. They're just off into the distance, so they look like caps of waves. I'm just going to get a little bit more white. But as I say, if it dries too dark, I can always lighten the same colour up. Get my flat brush all nice and loaded, and I can always do the more shallow ones that are closer. So look, you can barely see them while I'm painting this onto the canvas, but obviously when it dries, it will dry slightly darker, and these will just look like all the bobbling waves coming towards the beach. So it's really, really easy. You can barely notice them now, but look, as it gets darker, as it dries, you can just see these little wiggles, and it's just to create the illusion of texture and make it look 3D. So I'm just doing a few. I don't want to do too many because the water is going to be really shallow here. So imagine if you were stepping in this water, it'd be up to sort of your feet and your ankles. So I'm just doing a few zigzags, a few little ripples just over the top. And then we're going to paint that wave a little bit darker because it's more powerful. So I'm just going to add a little bit more blue and a little bit of dioxazine purple. Tiny bit of yellow just to turn it a little bit more greener, and a little bit of this colour, which is phthalo green, which is a nice sort of sea colour, so it should turn it a little bit more blue. Now sometimes when you have a colour on your palette, it looks really, really nice and realistic, but when you have it on the painting, sometimes it can change the value. So I painted this originally, this colour, later in the painting I change it because I think it's just a bit too blue. Excuse the focus. I think it looks a little bit out of place. It's a bit too blue. So if you will see me later correct that, you can add a little bit more purple and a little bit of white, turn it more grey if you're painting along at home. Because I think mine's just got too much blue in it. And I think even though it's a big wave, it just sort of doesn't work. And then all I'm doing, look, I'm using that brush, the flat edge of the brush, just to create some ripples to make it look like far away, powerful waves sort of building up. And then I'm just coming off from that big wave and again just creating some ripples just so the two areas merge. So there's again not a big jump in colour. But can you see now we're zoomed in, how the blending underneath is tricking the eye to make everything look really 3D. And with that colour, look, I'm just going to go along the edge of my wave just to make it look like it's in the shade, like it's got its back to the light. And then I'm going to wipe away all the paint on my brush, apart from a tiny bit. And I'm just going to go over some of these waves just to make them a little shade darker, just so they're a little bit more noticeable. Just some of my ripples, but I'm hardly touching the canvas. It's going to be really, really subtle. Just create the illusion of texture. So look, we've got this big powerful wave, as I say, and then we've got the nearer one. So if you find that you need to change something, look, you can lighten it up. That is the wonderful thing with acrylics. Just add a little bit of phthalo green to it. You can just change anything, and I'm going to wipe most of the paint out, and all I'm going to do, look, I was kind of experimenting when I was painting this. I was kind of creating like the nice clear water you have that shines through a wave, so I was kind of playing about with that. So I was just kind of creating like the illusion of light coming through the wave to make it more 3D. I'm just smudging it with my finger so it looks softer, more realistic. The wobbly painting while I rub it. So let's add a little bit more purple to turn it more grey. And as I say, look, you can just colour over things. So I think mine was a bit too blue. So I've just added a little bit more purple to turn it more grey. So the values all match and all the sort of colours all match. So there's nothing you can't fix. So that's why I love acrylics. And I love oil paints, don't get me wrong, I'm going to do plenty more oil paint tutorials for you. But I find acrylics are so easy and forgiving to teach because they're quick and you can just dry things and correct them instantaneously. Like you can literally just dry this with a hairdryer and go over it in 5 seconds with a different colour. So that's what's so great about them. So if you're at home, look at that, look how real that looks. So we've got our lovely sand. So why don't we do some shadow on the sand? Make that look realistic. So what I'm doing, I'm going to add some white and yellow and some purple to get back our sand colour. So we're going to add a little bit more purple just to make it a little bit darker. And let's load up our brush, let's add a little bit more purple. So we're kind of making the colour, little tiny bit of ultramarine blue. We're kind of making the sort of medium colour of the ocean water. And I'm going to wipe away again most of the paint. And just like we did some of the ripples, look, I'm going to kind of create the illusion of perspective. Now excuse the light. All I'm going to do is come away diagonally. If I turn away from the light, excuse me, I'm trying to create the illusion of diagonal sort of ripples. And these are sort of like the crevices and dents in the sand to create texture. So now look, if I tip the canvas so you can see it a little bit better, I'm just trying to create these lines and I'm having them more diagonal as they go towards the right hand side, if that makes sense. I'm just going to add a little bit of white to make a lighter shade. And all I'm going to do is just put a little bit of highlights on each one, just so it looks like a bit of light shining down. Again, if you have dark, you've got to have light. So when you're happy doing a few of them, we're going to just work on some highlights on the water. So all we're going to do, we're going to mix some sky colour, which is lots and lots and lots of white, and some of our cool ultramarine blue. So plenty of white, a little bit of ultramarine blue to turn it more purpley blue. And we're going to swap to a smaller brush. So I'm just using a big chunky brush to mix it. And all I'm going to do, look, I'm just going to start putting some little bits of highlights on some of the waves. This is a really lovely trick, is to basically get a fine liner brush and just go along the line of your wave. And this looks like the light shining down on the top of your wave as it comes towards the shore. So if you imagine the sky is nice and pastel blue, it's shining down onto our wave and it gives it just a 3D effect. So I'm just going to smudge it with my finger so it's nice and soft. And then again, look, just having a few little ripples. So just lovely little highlights in between your waves. Really, really soft because we want to push them back. And again, look, you can just smudge it with your finger. It just gives the illusion of the sunlight shining down. And then also, when we start putting the sea foam over the top in a minute, it just kind of links the two areas together from your shallow water to your waves. So I'm just doing this in between some of the waves. I'm just trying to kind of create shapes. It kind of looks like some of the sea foam, you know, you get the bubbles and things like that. Because it's a really realistic colour with the white and the ultramarine, it will link the two areas together when we start putting all the other bits and bobs over the top. So I'm just doing that all the way along, really taking a few minutes to do, just in between some of those shadows. There we go. And then as I say, look, as we come down, look, we can start creating sort of like little ripples, little highlights in between the waves. If anyone's been watching the previous tutorials with the sort of waves and the ripples that we've been doing for the last like couple of weeks, this is kind of like a trick. Look, I'm going round the shadows. I'm just using the soft edge of that brush and I'm just smoothing it with my finger. So everything looks really, really soft, really, really lovely and curvy. I don't want any really harsh lines or really sharp angles. I want everything to look really soft and smooth like water. And again, look, I'm just doing this all the way along. And the great thing is, once we start putting all the highlights and everything over top, it should link the water to our wave and make everything look hyper realistic. So let's just do a few at the bottom here. So I like to create sort of like squashed little triangles or like little sort of zigzags to make like diamond shapes. And then look, all I do is just then rub them with my finger just to make them look softer. So I'm going back to my big brush. I'm getting lots of white and a little bit of ultramarine blue. And I'm going to mix some of the more of that sky colour. And then all I'm going to do, I'm going to wipe away most of the paint again. So I've got barely any paint on my brush. My brush is really nice and soft. And all I'm going to do, look, at the same angle that I've done these lines, I'm just going to smudge it. And this is going to look like sunlight reflecting on the wet sand as the water comes onto the beach. And what it does, by leaving, look, gaps where we've got the darker shade, where we've got that lovely purple, it just creates ridges and it makes it look like sunlight reflecting down onto the wet sand. So I've got barely any paint on my brush. I'm just really gently stroking it against the rough canvas, and what it's doing is just creating like a nice shade. Look, I can just shade it, and let's do that as we continue down, and it should leave gaps so we've got the nice dry sand in between, and it should look like texturized sand. So how cool is this? To say, all these fantastic tips and tricks, and then we'll get a little bit of that colour, and then we're just going to go round the outline of our wave. So I'm using a chunky brush because I can then cover more distance quickly, so I can get a nice thick outline. So I'm just going to go around my wave. And then what I'm going to do, I'm just going to smooth it, look, into the previous shade by barely touching the brush, just so the outline is barely noticeable and it just looks more natural and realistic. Take your time. Just go with the flow, try to relax. And all I'm doing now, look, I'm just doing the exact same technique as I did on the previous wave. I've swapped back to my little brush, and I'm just going around it with some of this white and ultramarine blue sky colour, and I'm just smudging it with my finger. So rinse and repeat. So I've said previously in the last couple of tutorials we've all been doing on water and how to paint realistic water, is a lot of it is just repetition and being chilled enough to not rush and really enjoy the process. So there we go, that's looking cool. So I'm going to swap back to a clean brush, and I'm going to mix some white, and we're going to paint our wave. Now when you lay the white, all I would like you to do is create sort of like an inch thick border, and this is going to be all our lovely sea foam. Now when you lay the white, sometimes it looks really white and bright, but as I said in many of these tutorials, acrylics always, because they're water based, they absorb the colours underneath, so you might have to give it 2 coats of paint. So don't be afraid to go over it twice if you want it to look much more white and thick. So if you have to go over it twice, go over it twice. Now just like the sand where we have these diagonal angles, we're going to kind of do that with the sea foam. So we're going to create this wash. So I kind of want it to go off and look more flat as it goes towards the right. So all I'm going to do, I'm going to get this thin brush, and I'm going to join some of my sea foam up to that big chunky white edge. So some of it I'm going to join and some of it I'm not. And I'm trying to create sort of circles and sort of like tentacles kind of thing. So think of like spaghetti or something. Look, I'm creating little circles and blobs, And this is to look like sea foam. So some I'm joining together and some I'm not. But I'm deliberately leaving gaps in the underpainting. So look, some are joined to that border, but some aren't. And I'm deliberately leaving gaps so some of the underpainting can show up underneath. And you can have odd round circles to look like bubbles. So look, just creating these circles. I'm leaving gaps in between, so sometimes you get little air holes in between them. But as I move towards the right, can you see I'm trying to change the angle now and make it go slightly more diagonal? So as I say, you could do these big round circles, have some joining up, some not joining up. Just take your time. There's no right way to do this. But I kind of try to use this round-headed brush because I kind of try to make them look more circular. And don't worry, look, if you make a mistake and you splodge your white and it looks a bit scruffy, you can always get some of the underpainting colour and poke back holes. So look, they're going more flat as I go up, if that makes sense. So look, I'm trying to go more diagonal, and what that should do is make the painting look much more hyper realistic because it looks like it's fading off towards the right. See how that works? And it creates perspective. So I'm going to swap back to a little brush. Now I've done the big chunky ones, and I'm just going to put in finer detail. So all I'm doing, look, I'm just linking some of the areas. I'm doing odd bubbles and froth. Look, I can even do little dots to create bubbles. And again, it's the same technique. Some of them I'm linking to one another, some of them I'm not. I'm just creating these little loops and sort of circles, sort of zigzags, odd bubbles. But the angle of them is kind of what's creating the realism. So this painting took me about an hour and a half to paint, but obviously I'm condensing this down to under 40 minutes. I'm thinking of maybe doing a Patreon for the die-hard people who want like 2-hour, 3-hour videos, but it depends on the demand because I teach a lot in person as well, and obviously I create these videos and all the other things I do with the art. So I'm kind of like a one-man band playing all the instruments at the moment, so I'm a bit overstretched. So we'll wait and see. If there's a big demand for it, we could always maybe do that in the future. But I think these tutorials are pretty cool for what they are. And I think YouTube is such a fantastic platform that you're getting all this information for free and you can learn it and binge on it. So if you're like myself, it's fantastic to go out and learn anything you want. So look, all I'm doing is rinsing and repeating with my thin brush, and I'm going at that angle to create the perspective. As I say, if you find that your painting dries a bit rubbish and you've got like some of the underpainting shining through on your border, just get some white straight out the tube, go over it, because it's amazing how much prettier and nicer it looks just from taking your time and going over it. Now this is a cool trick. You can wipe away most of the paint, and just like you did with the ultramarine blue and white, you can add a bit of reflection of the wave onto the wet sand. So by just getting some white and coming down, we can just create the illusion of some light shimmer on our wet sand. So look, I'm just wiping away most of the paint and I'm just coming down and I'm just gently scraping against the rough canvas. I've not really got hardly any water on my brush. My brush is pretty dry, and look, I'm just smudging it. And it just looks like a bit of reflection of the wave onto the wet sand. And again, it just adds to the realism. So a really nice, easy trick. And it really complements the ultramarine blue underneath, because you get kind of a difference in shades. But again, with this trick, again, because look, you do it, sometimes it's really noticeable at first, but then the white absorbs the ultramarine blue and the sand colour underneath. So if you have to go over it twice, you have to go over it twice. So don't be afraid, as I say, this tutorial sped up. At home when you're painting along, don't be afraid to take your time and really enjoy the process. Anything you love, you will do better if you enjoy it, because you'll lose all sense of time and you'll just have fun. So this is looking really, really cool. We've got our lovely wave. That was my impression of a wave. And we've got this lovely sea foam now. And we've kind of want to create a 3D border. So look, if you imagine this paintbrush, it's got a dark edge to it where the sunlight is not hitting it as much. So we kind of want to do that with our water. I am absolutely covered in paint. But we want to do that on our outer border to give a bit of definition between our wave and our sand. And we can do that and make it look more 3D using different colours. So first we're going to get some white and ultramarine blue. And we're going to make it a little bit darker than the sky colour. So we're going to add a little bit more purple and a little bit more blue. And we're going to make this nice cool blue. We're going to add a little bit of light grey. Now if you haven't got light grey, you can make it with lots of white, black and orange randomly. And all we're going to do, look, we're just going to go around our border and create a lovely sort of cool blue around it, and that's going to give it the illusion of being 3D. So this is all the bit of the sea foam that's not getting as much sunlight, and by using a cool blue and going around the edges, we can make our work look 3D. So this is a good trick to do anything that's white. So I think back in the day we painted a lovely landscape of a villa. And when you have like villas that are bright white in places like Greece and Spain and Portugal and things like that, you have the white walls, and you can use this colour to make it look like things are in the shade. So I'm just adding a little bit more white to our mix. And all I'm going to do is just create a medium colour to go around the edges. So the jump again in colour isn't so harsh. So again, you barely notice from it changing from one colour to the other. So there we go. So we've got this lovely outer border, and then now we're going to create a darker color to make it look like it's underneath the wave. So we're going to get purple, ultramarine blue to make it nice and dark, and this is going to create a cool color. We're going to get some of our light gray and some burnt umber brown, and it should turn it into a darker grey, but that burnt umber brown should suck out most of the colour to make it look less vibrant and more grey. Look, so brown is a fantastic colour for getting rid of like really bright colours. So adding a little burnt umber brown, especially when we're painting seascapes and stuff, it makes everything look really realistic. So there we go. So we've got this nice cool grey. Look at that. That is lovely. And it's a little bit too dark, and remember, acrylics always dry darker, so let's just go lighter. And if it's too dark, we can always lighten it up. So let's splodge this all together, kind of get it in between. I find making the colours takes longer than the actual painting. But that's where the realism comes. So look, you can see me going back and forth, back and forth. And this is what I was saying about editing a video. Sometimes I spend 20 minutes trying to find a colour. And look, all I'm going to do is get a thin brush and go round my border. So it's going to look quite harsh at first because obviously it's a big jump. Look, it looks very dark, doesn't it? And it kind of makes it look cartoony. But don't worry, I have a solution which I'm going to teach you in a minute. And these ones, look, I'm not going to go all the way around. I'm just going to go sort of a bit round, and I'm going to try create a 3D effect. And then what I can do is you can use a thinner brush and kind of link these two areas together, look, with a thinner brush. So it kind of makes it look 3D. Now, as I say, look, there's a huge jump between that dark colour and our cool blue. So look, if we mix the two together, we can soften that edge up, just like we did with the white and the blue, and we can make it look like there's not so much a harsh jump. So all I'm doing, look, is just going round it reworking areas, trying to soften areas up. I want everything to look real. So as you say, take your time. And then I'm going to use the same colour to go underneath the line on the bottom side. And that gives it a hum to make it look like there's a little bit of shadow underneath. Because it's not as harsh as the colour, again it softens that outline. So again, we've done this with waves on and water, where we create the sparkles, where we create a hum around the sparkles. It's the same thing with shadows. When we've done that for the lights and we make these brilliant highlights in the previous tutorials, we're kind of doing the same thing but with the shadows. It just softens it and makes it look much more realistic. And as I say, these tutorials we're doing very, very quickly, but if you were doing this at home with a reference photo, you can make it look hyper real. So that is looking really, really cool. You can even mix, as I say, some of this colour. And if you wanted to, you could put some shadows in your water ripples. If you find, like me, that you've gone a bit gung-ho with the white, look, you can poke holes back into your sea foam. So if you find you've gone a bit too over the top with the white and you want it to look a bit more less scruffy, look, you can poke holes. So we often do this with clouds, where you go back and you can poke some of the sky through the clouds. It's the same equivalent with water. Look, you can go back and just create some bubbles, little texturized bits. And then this, but like as I say, there's a bit of a jump. Now it's dry. I still don't like it. And in real life I spent about half an hour going back and forth and getting annoyed and getting the rage. But I have not done this for the video. I've cut all that out. But look, all I went is made it more grey. I just made it less blue. So I went over it again. If I hadn't told you, you probably wouldn't have noticed. But I'm telling you now, most artists have issues. So I've signed her on the bottom corner and I put her on a nice easel. So we've got this lovely realistic painting, and it's the underpainting at the beginning that took ages, but that's the thing that makes it. So we've got these jumps in colour that you barely notice, and we go from warm sand colour to cool blues, and we've got the purple, these neutral colours in between to sort of link the areas together. And then we've put all the detail over the top. So we've got this lovely powerful wave, we've got the highlights on top and the divots to create the texture. We've got this lovely shadow to bring it forward to look like it's coming towards you. And we've got the lovely sea foam, and you've learned how to paint water hyper realistically. And this is the finished painting. I want to varnish her this week. She looks really, really lovely. So I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. And don't forget to like and subscribe. We've got plenty of water playlists now. We've got lots of tutorials on how to paint water. So happy painting, binge away, and take care. See you soon. Bye.